Subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon to never miss an update from RAU'S IAS. Do not forget to subscribe to our Telegram channel for all the updates and materials.
Hello and welcome to Daily News Simplified, an answer to what, why and how of newspaper analysis from the perspective of civil services examination. Today we have taken up daily edition of The Hindu newspaper dated 26th of August 2022. The articles which we shall be taking up today have been displayed on the screen. Let us now begin the discussion with an important announcement. All the magazines of our Mains Compass 2022 series, which is the annual compilation for the mains examinations, have been uploaded on Amazon. The link to these magazines have been provided in the description of the video. Let us now begin the discussion. So the first article which we have taken for today's discussion is neither an editorial nor an FAQ. It has not appeared on text and context page either, but rather it is a data point, titled as Privatizing Banks. So in an article titled Privatization of Public Sector Banks, an Alternative Perspective, published in the RBI Bulletin, the authors have cautioned the government against a big bang approach of privatization of these banks, as it would do more harm than good. The article provides an alternative view that justifies the role of public sector banks. The report shows that the state-owned banks or the public sector banks have the most branches in rural areas. As you can see in this graph, the concentration of public sector banks in rural areas comes out to be almost 150%. If you look at the sectoral lending, these 3 bar graphs denote the public sector banks and these 3 bar graphs denote the private banks. In sectors like industry and agriculture, the public sector banks in combination are much higher as compared to the private banks. When it comes to infra lending, you can see that this blue graph is much higher as compared to this orange graph, which denotes the private banks. So around more than 80% of the infrastructure funding in our country is currently led by the public sector banks. And so using these graphs, the authors want to claim that if the rumors about the privatization of public sector bank is true, it's not a good idea to go ahead with. And so in this discussion, we will first understand very briefly historical perspectives on banking sector, starting from complete private sector to going complete public or nationalization. Then we will look into the current or present status of the banking sector in our country. What are the advantages that they have provided but with significant demerits, and what we can do as a way forward. So before we go on and talk about privatization of public sector banks, it is important to have some brief historical perspective into India's banking sector, because unless and until we understand that, we won't be able to understand or appreciate from where this privatization of PSBs is coming from. Starting with the phase of nationalization, which started in 1969 and lasted until 1991, when entry of new private banks was allowed. So India's public sector banks are nothing but legacy banks from the colonial period that were later nationalized. For example, India's largest public sector banks, which is State Bank of India, was founded as Bank of Calcutta in 1806. Later, took the name of Imperial Bank of India in 1921 and became state-owned bank in 1955. And similarly, the remaining public sector banks in India were formed through 2 waves of nationalization, one in 1969 and another one in 1980. So after the 1980 nationalization, PSBs had a 91% share in the national banking market, with the remaining 9% held by old private banks or OPBs that were continued in private sector. And it was only under the wave of 1991 reforms that RBI issued the policy guidelines to facilitate the entry of new private banks. Subsequently, it led to the entry of large-sized private banks like HDFC, ICICI, Axis Bank, and other such banks. Then slowly and gradually, a lot of committees, for example, Narsimhan Committee of 1991, PJ Nayak Committee of 2014, recommended the consolidation or merger of public sector banks. And that is what happened in 2019, when finally the 10 public sector banks were merged into 4 large banks. After the mergers, there were only 12 public sector banks, including the SBI. And now we enter into the present phase, where The government is contemplating and also working on a proposal to privatize some of the existing public sector banks, and hence the reason for our discussion. So now I guess you understand the context under which we are talking about privatization. To start with, India did not have public sector banks, but rather they were the nationalized private banks. But simply because there are around 12 public sector banks and they command majority shareholding in the banking sector means we are going to privatize them? Is this a valid enough reason for privatization of public sector banks? No, of course not. There are other concerning issues because of which the privatization of public sector banks makes complete sense. And you will also kind of support the privatization if you understand the present status of the public sector banks, which are reeling under extremely high non-performing assets or NPAs. The PSBs account for around 80% of the overall NPAs of the banking sector. But the story doesn't end there. If you compare the NPAs or non-performing assets of the public sector banks with those of new private banks like ICICI and HDFC and Axis Bank, you'll find that the NPAs in public sector banks are around 12% on an average higher than the new private banks. The total gross NPAs of the PSBs, which stands around 7.5 lakh crores, is more than 1.5 times the total money spent by India on the creation of infrastructure in 2019. So whatever India is spending on infra creation, around 150% of that is just held as gross NPA by the public sector banks. Apart from that, if you look at credit creation or credit growth, which is the main purpose of the bank's existence, between 2010 and 2019, the annual credit growth of PSB stands at hardly around 4%. And this is quite low as compared to the annual credit growth of around 15 to 29% registered by private sector banks. So you can clearly see, on an average, new private banks are creating credit which is at least 4 times that of public sector banks. Then of course all of us know that when it comes to losses, no one can even touch and come near to the public sector banks, where the cumulative loss of PSBs due to bad loans accounted for around 66,000 crores. This is almost equal to the budgetary allocation for the primary education sector. Apart from that, we have seen rapid increase in the banking frauds, where PSBs accounted for around 93% of the total fraud cases and around 85% of the fraud amounts that were reported in 2018 and 19, which basically highlights the poor quality of monitoring and screening in public sector banks. And all these factors put together basically mean loss of taxpayers' money. And this was specifically mentioned in Economic Survey 2020, which clearly stated that every rupee of the taxpayers' money which is invested in PSBs fetches a market value of merely 71 paise. On the other hand, every rupee invested in new private bank fetches a market value of 3.7 rupees. And if you compare these two amounts, it's like 5 times as much value as that of a rupee invested in a PSB. This shows that the taxpayers' money is inefficiently being deployed in the public sector banks, which in turn is leading to loss of both government as well as the taxpayers' money. And finally, of course, all of us know about the lower efficiencies of public sector banks, especially when compared to the new private banks, which is of course manifested in the form of lower return on assets as well as equity. And to sum it all, you can clearly see that India's banking sector and economy has fallen into a vicious cycle, where the slowdown in the economy entails higher non-performing assets of PSBs, which then means that there would be lower and slower credit creation, which then means higher losses, loss of taxpayers' money, which means lower efficiency as compared to NPBs, and which again means slowdown in the Indian economy. And hence, everyone is talking privatization. The government policy of privatization of existing PSBs is of course based on philosophy that government should discontinue its engagement in producing goods and services in sectors where competitive market have emerged.
The enterprises in those sectors are most likely to perform better in the hands of private sector due to various factors such as technology upgradation, efficient management practices, and would thus create wealth and add to the economic growth of the country. And hence, it's important for us to discuss advantages of privatization of public sector banks as well. And so there is no denying the fact that privatization will definitely lead to the improvement in overall efficiency of the banks. As we have highlighted before, even though public sector banks and new private banks are operating in the same domestic market, the PSBs are considered to be less efficient and thus leading to loss of taxpayers' money. And so it is of course expected that the privatization of PSBs would lead to improvement in the efficiency of the banking sector. Then the next point is very important. Enhanced competition leading to the creation of mega banks, which are essential or imperative for booming economy. And it's just not our belief or thinking. History has been indeed testimony to the fact that the development of large economies such as US, Japan and China has always been supported by large banks. For example, during 1980s, Japan had 15 of the top 25 global banks. In recent times, economic growth of China has been supported by its 4 banks, which are considered to be top 4 banks across the globe. On the other hand, since 1969, India has grown significantly to become the 5th largest economy in the world. Yet, India's banking sector is disproportionately underdeveloped given the size of its economy. For instance, India has only one bank in the global top 100, and India's top rated bank SBI is placed around 55th position at the global level. And this highlights the dwarfism of our banking sector when compared to our other parameters, for example, size of the economy, development of the GDP per capita. And a lot of people think that the government ownership of the PSBs, which account for almost 70% of the banking assets, has led to a kind of virtual monopoly which is reducing the competition, breeds inefficiency and hurts the overall growth and consolidation of the private sector banks. At the same time, privatization of the public sector banks would also reduce the financial burden on the government by doing away with the need of undertaking the recapitalization every now and then to comply with the higher Basel II requirements. Then finally, according to a number of experts, the policy of bank nationalization has not actually benefited the Indian economy. Because when socialist supporters of nationalization claim that allocation of banking resources to rural areas, agriculture and priority sectors was responsible for elevation of poverty from 1969 to 1991, the opponents claimed that the poverty reduction is not entirely due to nationalization, but rather it was a result of Green Revolution and a lot of poverty alleviation programs such as IRDP, which mainly contributed to the poverty reduction and not really the nationalization of the banks. When the supporters of nationalization claimed that there was tenfold increase in the number of rural banks between 1969 and 1980, the detractors claimed that proactive policies by RBI has been responsible for improving the financial inclusion in rural areas and not really the bank nationalization. So for example, RBI came up with 4:1 formula, where a bank was required to open 4 rural branches before it could obtain a license to open an urban branch. And so it was not really a result of nationalization, but rather an innovative policy making by RBI. But is privatization of PSBs really a panacea? Is it going to solve all the problems plaguing our public sector banks once they are privatized? And so the obvious answer is of course no. Because the need is not so much in privatization, but in overhauling the public sector bank's governance structure. There is a need for undertaking a detailed, comprehensive and analytical study to understand the reasons for the poor performance of PSBs. And this would tell us whether the government should go for privatization or not. And the main reason for lower efficiency of public sector bank is actually government's political intervention in the functioning of the PSBs, which in turn leads to lack of autonomy and freedom to the PSBs and thus hurting their revenues. And so according to experts, the solution to improve the efficiency of PSBs is not privatization, rather a complete overhaul of the governance framework. And so some of the reasons because of which, or some of the external constraints because of which PSBs are not able to perform well are dual regulation by Finance Ministry as well as RBI. The Finance Ministry's directives could be both explicit through the issue of guidelines and through undocumented cession. However, the private sector banks are free from this dual regulation. At the same time, when you look at the board constitution, the appointment of the boards of the banks are mainly based on political considerations without giving due emphasis to merit. Average tenures of chairmen and executive directors are very short, all of which lead to weak empowerment of the boards. And then finally, when we look at the external vigilance enforcement through CVC or CBI, inhibits the public sector banks from taking commercial risks which are otherwise deemed acceptable. So on one hand, a private sector bank would be able to take the risks, and if that risk goes against the bets, the questions won't be asked on the ethical dimensions of the decision taken. But that is not the case with public sector banks. If a director takes a decision which turns into a loss, then the questions will be asked by both CBI and CBI, and that's when the employees of public sector banks become risk averse. So these are the three pillars which need to be overhauled in order to improve the governance of the public sector banks, and then we can compare them with private sector banks. And it is expected that with these improvements, their efficiency will rise to the level of the new private banks. Apart from this, you have to understand that privatization may not solve the problems which public sector banks are facing. Because we have to realize that even all new private banks are not as efficient. The balance sheets of existing new private banks is as poor as PSBs. Just like how the government tries to micromanage the PSBs, even the promoters of the new private banks have been guilty of doing the same. The case in point was the Yes Bank crisis. Similarly, number of banking frauds of much higher value have come to light in new private banks as well. So it is not the ownership structure that determines the efficiency of the banks. Rather, it is the quality of the governance framework and effective regulation which is key to promote efficiency of public sector banks. And so in this regard, the government would do the right thing by implementing the recommendations of the PJ Nayak committee to improve the governance of PSBs. Now let us know in the comment section what were the main recommendations of the PJ Nayak committee. Freebies, a judicial lead and a multi-layered issue, appears as a lead article on page number 6. So the Prime Minister's recent comment on freebies handed out by governments has reignited the debate on the economic rationale for granting subsidies. Author talks about various instances and examples of freebies and also their impact on policy measures in our country. And now the question is, where do the state finds the revenue to fund such profligacy or the wastefulness in that sense in the use of resources according to the ex-RBI governor? If you look into the GS Paper 2 syllabus, welfare schemes for vulnerable sections of the population by center and state, and performance of these schemes is a part of his syllabus. And it's just not the Aam Aadmi Party government of Punjab or Delhi who has been doing this, but almost all the states and the center are responsible for running out these schemes in the form of freebies. And so the obvious question is, why these political parties resort to the distribution of freebies? What could be the arguments in support of these freebies? But what are the larger challenges which the recent trend of distribution of freebies pose in front of India? There is a practice question for you as well. Electoral promises in the form of freebies raise several questions which go beyond finances. Discuss. You have to write this answer in 250 words, and I hope that with the discussion which follow, you will be able to answer this question. So we have seen that in past 10 to 20 years, political parties promise to offer free electricity and water, monthly allowance to unemployed, daily wage workers and women, as well as distribution of electronic gadgets like smartphones and laptops in order to secure the vote of the people. And all political parties are guilty in this act. The states have become habituated to giving freebies, be it in form of loan waivers or the distribution of even Mangal Sutra in some cases. And so it begs for a discussion as to what are the causes behind this recent trend. Because after the independence, government has been running a lot of social sector schemes, has been running a lot of economic sector schemes to alleviate poverty to give relief to the poor people, but still there is a need for distribution of freebies just before the elections. And how do you distinguish freebie from any other important scheme which has been well thought out? For example, how is a distribution of a smartphone to the school going students and promising to do that is different from distribution of, let's say, loan for the construction of the house? So freebie is basically a commodity which is given to the population free of cost, without any charge, and it is generally made just before the elections without taking into consideration the financial cost that it might involve if that party gets elected. Now, of course, when we talk about the causes behind the rampant distribution of freebies in almost all the states and the center, the two arguments which clearly hold out in support is that India still observes very large scale level of poverty, and COVID-19 pandemic has not only exacerbated the pain of the poor people, but also it has led to large scale marginalization of the unemployed people. And so in order to allow them to support their livelihood, it might be necessary to distribute some of the goods and services free of cost, and for that, if state has to incur some kind of financial burden, be it has to be done. But apart from that, it also shows, or it is also caused by lack of political discourse on important issues like health, investment in education, industrial development, infrastructure creation. All of these put together also shows political immaturity of the population of our country. Because distribution of free electricity or a smartphone to thousands of people is very easy as compared to reforming of health and education sector structurally. That requires much more investment as well as determination and hard work. And so neither the people and hence nor the politicians are concerned about these long-term reforms, because the work can be easily done by promising freebies. And that is where it becomes important for us to discuss whether the freebies should be distributed or what are the arguments in support of the distribution of the freebies. To start with, we have to look into the Constitution under Article 39B, which calls for resource distribution for achieving common welfare or common good. And so the Constitution of India in that sense places an obligation on the state to take proactive measures for the welfare of the poor and downtrodden. And of course, freebie in that sense is kind of serving that purpose. Then, if you look at the status of social inequality in our country, take the reference, for example, of Oxfam report 2021, which showed that the income of 84% of the households in the country declined in 2021. In India, there is a wide inequality between rich and poor, and it is widening every year. And so, it would be responsible to provide for some of the basic necessities of the poor in terms of the distribution of the freebies. And that is where the poor also need a kind of safety net. Safety net, or as the word suggests, it's a kind of net which is used at the construction site to prevent people from falling off and hitting the ground, which might become fatal to them. And similarly, in real life situation, you have a lot of instances. For example, the best case scenario is COVID itself, which left a lot of people unemployed for almost 2 years, especially people belonging to unorganized informal sector who did not have any kind of social security. And if you are distributing freebies in this context, it might be absolutely justified, because otherwise these people will not only fall below poverty line, but their mere existence might become very, very difficult for such a prolonged time. Then of course, some people say, some economic experts say that this whole conversation is distorted, because when the freebies are distributed to rich people, it is categorized as subsidies or incentives. The well-off and the business families get freebies that are in just incentives. For example, since 2006, the union budget estimates that the richest people in our country have been given incentives to the tune of 4 to 6 lakh crore each year. And no one talks about these kinds of incentives which are also given to industrialists. And if you take into account the total exchequer's burden in distribution of freebies, it's minuscule in that comparison. Then there is another social angle as well. Since there is so much of inequality and poverty in our society, there is a rising discontent in the society. And so the distribution of freebies enable the government to release the growing discontent in the marginalized section, at least temporarily. And then finally, there's no denying the fact that distribution of these freebies boosts the industries as well. For example, states like Tamil Nadu and Bihar are known for giving women sewing machines, saris, and cycles. And all these are local Indian brands. And so when state procures such vast amount of freebies from local manufacturers, it is directly giving boost to the industries as well. So you can clearly see that there are 6 very solid rationale behind the system of freebies. But there are equally compelling arguments against the distribution of freebies as well, where the arguments put forth by the author today comes very handy. And first and foremost argument, even important than the fiscal stress that it puts on the state and central government, is the fact that it leads to declining productivity of the masses, because freebies create a feeling in the masses that they can live with minimal effort. Now, if people start believing that government is there to take care of each and every necessity of their life, as well as in some cases luxury, this obviously decreases their productivity to work or motivation to work hard. And a trend has been created that whoever avail loan from banks does not repay them will definitely get a waiver during the next election is something which is not correct. Now we know that the fiscal situation of most of the states is in shambles. In last few days we have seen the report which has highlighted top 10 states and the level of debt which they have is quite unsustainable. And since they do not have the revenues to match with their expenses, these kinds of freebies forces the states to borrow. Now they can't borrow because they have a limit of FRBM. And so this borrowing takes the form of off-budget borrowing, or what CAG defines as extra budgetary borrowings, which are taken by the public sector undertakings of these state governments, which are not shown or which do not become the part of the annual budget, but ultimately has to be paid by the states. And if you look at the image on your screen very carefully, you will realize that the current level of debt, especially in the states of Rajasthan, Punjab, is quite unsustainable. And in that extra borrowing which they are doing, the choice is to either create infrastructure, capital infrastructure, which is going to serve for many, many years to come, or to distribute freebies. And now the trend is that these states are increasingly choosing freebies because of their temporary benefit and the ability of the freebies to get them elected in the elections. Then at the same time, it vitiates free and fair election, which basically undermines the spirit of democracy. This is the primary concern, as many people tend to vote for parties based on their free incentives offered by them, irrespective of the fact what they have committed for social infrastructure, economic infrastructure, what are their plans for social harmony, how have they performed in the past in terms of law and order. Everything overtakes, and just the freebies, it looks like, decides the fate of the elections, which is not good. At the same time, it is also a discrimination against honest taxpayer, because it creates a sense of discontent in the mind of an honest taxpayer whose money is being used to distribute the freebie. And finally, we have discussed this point indirectly, but directly also we have to mention this because it leads to wasteful resource allocation. Your resource is already limited, and so the government has to be very wide in choosing the expenses, and so it is a wasteful resource allocation because first and foremost, distribution of smartphone is a short-term measure. It does not create any capacity, either capital, economic or human resources in long term, and so ultimately these freebies have to be distributed again and again in a timely fashion. Whereas if you create good schools, good hospitals, good roads, if you better the public transport, enable the people to access clean groundwater, these are the measures which are going to help the country in a long term. But because of the distribution of freebies and the preference that it is getting, these long-term measures take up. So what can we do about this situation? How can we solve this problem of distribution of freebies? So in a kind of system where India has adopted, Parliament and the government get the full power to do whatever they want to do with the Consolidated Fund of India. But there are certain checks which we can draw on the finances side. Of course, on the side of morality, it's the people ultimately who have to be made more aware, and the political parties have to be mature enough to look into the future. But in terms of quantitative restrictions, the author suggests that we can amend the FRBM Act. The FRBM Acts of the center as well as the states need to be amended to enforce a more complete disclosure of the liabilities of their exchequers. Even under the current FRBN, if you look, governments are mandated to disclose their contingent liabilities, but that disclosure is restricted to liabilities for which they have extended an explicit guarantee. Now, this provision should be expanded to cover all liabilities, full liabilities, whether the loan has been taken by a public sector undertaking of the state or center, as long as the interest payment for that is going to go from consolidated funds, that should be disclosed. Now, if that is to be disclosed, then the freebies will be accountable. Then the state governments have to be accountable for the expenses that they are incurring, which is not the case right now. Then the second change which the author wants is from the central government. You know that under the constitution, states are required to take center's permission when they borrow if they have an outstanding amount. And now the center should not hesitate to impose conditionalities and should not hesitate to restrict states from offering freebies if they are not following a prudent consolidation path for their fiscal deficits. And then finally, the author suggests a very radical reform, which is the use of financial emergency. Because the constitution says, and constitution allows the president to declare financial emergency in any state if he or she is satisfied that the financial stability is threatened. Now, of course, this provision has never been used so far for the fear that this will turn into a political weapon of mass destruction, but the provision is there in the constitution for a reason. After all, the root cause of fiscal irresponsibility is the lure of electoral nirvana. This has been given in today's article, and this could also form a very good essay topic. It will stop only if political leadership fears the punishment. So, from the perspective of this year's mains, the question on freebie is a very, very probable one. And I hope that this discussion has covered what are freebies, what are the causes which lead the political parties to declare frequent freebies, what are the arguments in support and against the freebies, and finally, what are the way forward in terms of restricting the state and the central government in rampant distribution of freebies. Let us now move on to the next article.
This is an editorial article from page number 8. The article is based on the order given by the Madras High Court to the Tamil Nadu state government to adopt vocabularies for LGBTQ communities. This is said to be the first step in the community living a dignified life. We shall take the opportunity here to discuss the issues of LGBT and the Supreme Court judgments and the international conventions concerning the same in an elaborate manner. LGBTQ, and now this has been extended to IA+, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, intersex, asexual, and others. They all are now commonly grouped under this category LGBTQIA+. They are one of the most vulnerable and marginalized community globally. On the very fundamental level, the most basic unit of socialization, which is family, problem begins here. Because of lack of understanding and proper communications about the sexual orientation and gender identity, there is dissonance among the adolescent of LGBTQIA category. Then the infighting within the family begins, and that kind of breaks the family relationship of those people. In many cases, they are forced out of home. There are also instances of mental. This may have large repercussion on the overall health of LGBTQ community. It may also lead to substance abuse. It may also acutely affect their mental health because of the dissonance that they have concerning their sexual orientation, the stigma that they face even within the family, and much more outside the family. These discriminations, these leads to abuse, violence against them. It causes distress, sometimes very low self-worth. It may also result in self-hate. It is very difficult to find friends and members in the family who can understand what the person feels. Even the political parties, the religious leaders, they keep away from the LGBT movement and the LGBT issues. LGBT people, they are regularly targeted. They become victims of hate crime. Their problem keep on increasing, but the recourse for solution is not there. There are many barriers to the healthcare facilities for LGBTQ people. They generally do not take the help of the government healthcare facilities because of discrimination, because of possible violence against them. Most of them, they seek private healthcare facilities, and even there, majority of the psychiatrists, especially in India, still consider diverse sexual orientation and gender identities as a disorder, and they practice corrective therapies for it. The general attitude and behavior of people in society, at workplace, in government, they are apathetic. At worst, it could be intolerant, discriminatory, and harassing for these people. There is a great threat of violence due to their sexual orientation. Most of the LGBTQ people, they try to hide their identity at workplace. There are very few organizations in government and otherwise that openly hire people from LGBT community. And even if they do, they mostly hire transgenders, not the other categories within this broader category. LGBT people, they face a number of particular concerns as they age. They often do not access the healthcare facilities, they do not have affordable housing or any other social services or social securities. So the elderlies in the LGBTQ community, their position is far worse than the heterosexual elderly people. The heterosexual elderly people, at least they enjoy the family support, but in the LGBT community, they don't even have that. Let's now discuss the legal jurisprudence that exists, the Supreme Court observations, the international conventions that India is part of, and the laws that we have framed for LGBTQ people. In the LGBTQ movement, the thirst came with the Law Commission report, and Law Commission was the first body to recommend decriminalization of Section 377. Section 377 of Indian Penal Code, it's a relic of British India, of course. It states that whoever voluntarily has carnal intercourse against the order of nature with any man, woman, or animal shall be punished. This includes private consensual sex between adults of same sex as well. In the Nas Foundation versus Government of NCT of Delhi 2009, the Delhi High Court decriminalized homosexual acts involving the consenting adults, of course. But in the Suresh Kumar Kaushal case of 2013, Supreme Court overturned this judgment of Delhi High Court given in the Nas Foundation case. So homosexuality was criminalized once again. Supreme Court argued that in 150 years of IPC, less than 200 people have been prosecuted under Section 377. Therefore, the plight of sexual minorities could not be used as an argument for deciding constitutionality of the law. Also, the Supreme Court ruled that this was for legislature to look into the desirability of deleting Section 377 of IPC. Then in 2014, the famous Nalsa judgment came in which the Supreme Court observed that recognizing of transgenders as the third gender is not a social or medical issue. It's a human right issue. Under the Yogyakarta principles, which is based on application of international human rights law in relation to sexual orientation and gender identity. Here the Supreme Court said in the Nalsa judgment that Yogyakarta principles should be applied as part of Indian law. Building on this, in the very important Puttaswamy judgment, officially called as Justice K.S. Puttaswamy versus Union of India case of 2017, here Supreme Court ruled that fundamental right to privacy is intrinsic to life. Hence, right to privacy was made part of right to life, and thus comes under Article 21. Supreme Court declared that bodily autonomy was an integral part of right to privacy, and bodily autonomy is within the ambit of sexual orientation of the individual. So, as a natural consequence of the Puttaswamy judgment of 2017 came the Navteej Singh Johar case of 2018. And in this case, Supreme Court decriminalized homosexuality. Supreme Court dismissed its own position taken in the Suresh Kumar Kaushal case of 2013 that the LGBTQ community constitute a minuscule minority, and so there was no need to decriminalize homosexual sex. Supreme Court made very strong observations in the Navteej Singh Johar case. It said that an individual's right to develop one's individuality against the demand of social conformity must be recognized. It's a very important statement from the observation made by the Supreme Court in the Navtej Singh Johar case. An individual's right to develop one's individuality must be given preference over the demand of social conformity, because the majority opinion does not become the law of the land. Social morality cannot overshadow the constitutional morality. And hence, you also had a question in your exam on constitutional morality. This term was popularized in those days when Supreme Court was on a spree of giving socially important judgments. Right to privacy as part of fundamental right includes bodily integrity. Supreme Court also invoked right to equality in this judgment. Supreme Court observed that homosexuality is the order of nature for LGBTQ community. It also said that Section 377 was a weapon used to isolate, exploit, and harass the community. Supreme Court after this judgment gave many other judgments which further strengthen the stand taken here that the individuals have their right to bodily integrity. In 2018, there was another judgment, Shafin Jahan versus Ashokan case. Here, Supreme Court observed that choice of a partner is a person's fundamental right, and that can be also same-sex partner. In the Hadia judgment, Supreme Court said intimacies of marriage lies within the core zone of privacy. So the choice of a partner, whether within or outside marriage, lies within the exclusive domain of each individual, and the state or anyone else cannot intrude into that. Supreme Court also has said in the Shabrimala judgment that individual freedom must prevail over purported group rights. The same thing that Supreme Court said in the Navtej Singh Johar case. Individuality over the demand for social conformity. Supreme Court also has said in some other judgments that the Constitution protects personal liberty from disapproving audience. The social values and morals have their space, but they are not above the constitutionally guaranteed freedom. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948 also says that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. All human beings, that includes LGBTQ community. You must also know that WHO has removed homosexuality from its classification of diseases back in 1990. And many countries have taken many measures to protect the rights of LGBT community. For example, back in 2014, Finland recognized the same-sex marriage. You have to understand that in India, homosexuality has been decriminalized, but still the same-sex marriage is not recognized. And there is complete governance and administrative apathy towards these causes of LGBTQ people. In 2021, last year, there was a petition filed in Delhi High Court to recognize the same-sex marriage under the Hindu Marriage Act and Special Marriage Act. But the center took a very apathetic stand in the court. The center position was that living together as partners and having sexual relationship by same-sex individuals with the Indian family unit concept of a husband, a wife, and children, which necessarily presuppose a biological man as husband, a biological woman as wife, and the children born out of their union. So the executive does not want to recognize the same-sex marriage under the India's legislative setup. Further, you would know that the Parliament has passed the Transgender Persons Protection of Rights Bill 2019, which has now become the Act. But this has been severely criticized for its poor understanding of gender and sexual identity. Similarly, the LGBT community does not have the right to surrogacy. You see, in 2017, R. Raj Rao, he wrote a book, Criminal Love, Queer Theory, Culture and Politics in India. In this book, he says, homosexuality has always been looked down upon with disfavor by three agencies universal to mankind. These three agencies are religion, law, and medicine. And among them, the law committed the most unkindest cut of all. So it is necessary to protect the rights and dignities of these people, to help them realize the rights guaranteed to them by the Constitution of India, and they develop themselves as an individual with maximum potential. The safeguard of laws must be in place. Supreme Court through its judgment has helped to realize the rights of people from the LGBTQ community. But to strengthen them, And to ensure progressive realization of rights, the government, executive, and legislators they must work together to give legal safeguards through laws and administrative rules. This is a lead article from page number 9. Should India change its policy on the Rohingyas? Well, to change the policy on Rohingyas, India necessarily will have to change the refugee policy. So essentially the question is, what is the refugee policy of India? Do we need to differentiate between illegal migrants and refugees? And to bring into effect that legal differentiation, what kind of policy should we come up with? The definition, however, is present in the Refugee Convention 1951. This convention of UN defined refugees as any person fleeing persecution on ground of race, religion, nationality, social group, or political opinion. The convention makes it obligatory to the signatories to make available to the refugees legal rights. That will include the right to education, work, and property. The Refugee Convention of 1951 also has a very important principle called as principle of non-refoulement, meaning that the states will not send back refugees to get prosecuted back in their home countries. However, India is not party to 1951 Refugee Convention or its 1967 protocol. So this basic definition of refugee does not apply in Indian context. Further, Citizenship Act 1955 also does not define the term refugee. The Foreigners Act 1946 defines foreigners as a person who is not a citizen of India. But the act is silent as to who are refugees and illegal migrants. So all in all, we do not have basic definition of refugee. And that, according to the author, is the governance challenge with regard to refugees. India not only not has the definition of refugee, but India also does not have any national refugee protection framework or any law relating to domestic asylums. But despite this, India has set a stellar example of receiving refugees from all over the world. As a matter of fact, India hosts the highest number of refugees in the world. Sri Lankan Tamils, Tibetans coming from China, the Chin minorities of Myanmar, Hindus coming from Bangladesh and Pakistan, Persians, Jews, they all have been welcomed time and again by India. India, although not a signatory to United Nations Refugee Convention 1951, but India is a signatory to New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants. This is more holistic in nature and was adopted by 193 countries in 2016. This declaration has set a framework for refugee protection called as Global Compact on Refugees. One important thing to know about it, there is a provision of financial burden sharing, meaning the rich countries, they have to contribute more to the cause of refugee protection, because generally it is the middle income countries that host larger population of refugee. You should also know that India has signed UN Anti-Torture Convention, and this convention has a principle of non-refoulement. By signing this convention, India showed the readiness to accept this principle of non-refoulement. But India has not ratified this convention, and India is only one of the 5 countries that has not ratified it. So you understand that India is a country that is leading in hosting refugees from all over the world. But at the same time, our refugee policy is not very clear. And there are historical reasons as to why we do not have adopted a clear refugee policy. And by extension, why we have not signed UN Refugee Convention 1951. First and foremost, India was not involved in the preliminary discussion for the convention. Second of all, the convention is legally binding. And back then, immediately after independence, India was not ready to put itself into a legally binding convention vis-a-vis refugees. It was also India's stand that this Refugee Convention of 1951 was tailor-made to fit the requirement of post-World War II European countries. And the principle of non-refoulement was essentially seen in this context. But India was not ready for this principle, because India had real threat of hostile neighborhood from Western Pakistan, Eastern Pakistan and China. We had very porous border back then. Internal security threat would have been grave because of illegal migration, also because of concern of radicalization from the neighbor state. Also, the Refugee Convention of 1951 did not have any financial burden sharing provision. as the New York Declaration has. So India, after being newly independent after centuries of colonial plunder, was not ready for this to put a strain on infrastructure and resources of India. So India deliberately did not sign the Refugee Convention and did not have a very clear-cut refugee policy. But at the same time also set a stellar example of hosting refugees from all over the world. Now the big question is, should India change its stand? Should India come up with a refugee law that will be in consonance with the International Refugee Convention? The thing is, because we do not differentiate between foreigners and refugees, this essentially means that the refugees, they depend on the state's discretion, which may take away their basic natural rights. Also, in absence of a legal framework, there is possibility of domestic politicization of refugee issues. The state's discretion is evident in case of Citizenship Amendment Act 2019. The Citizenship Amendment Act 2019, using the wisdom by the government, has given citizenship right to certain section of community from certain countries in the neighborhood. But the act does not address the issue of refugees holistically. The issue essentially has remained at the discretion of the government. Citizenship Amendment Act has not actually created an administrative mechanism to recognize refugees so that they can be registered, they can be given with basic rights of education, health, livelihood, they can be protected from the conditions of persecution, and they can be sent back when the conditions in their homeland normalize. This is how we thought things to be. But in absence of a proper law on refugee, there is no administrative mechanism for this. And essentially, everybody is looked at as foreigners with little or no differentiation between illegal migrant and refugees. So the bottom line is essentially this: we may not join the Refugee Convention of United Nations of 1951, but we must definitely have our own internal refugee policy and refugee administration framework.